I'm the head of school in the School of Law in NUI Galway. Riúsle is mór an fléisir gom fáilte is fihid a chur roimh gan gógáil tábhachtach seo I gcoinne imachtaí míle séideag, ócáid a thugann seans dúin smuoine go devan an sort tionachar a bhí ag na himachtaí sin an dír seo ón am sin go dtí an lá atá an Joán. Ba chóir go mbeadh mion oscailte agan I leith na ceisne I leog a méid gá phlé agan inniu agus amárach, anas go mbeadh tuiscint níos fearr agan bhon téimi na gógála, dlí, réabhlóids agus ceannasacht. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great privilege to welcome you all to NUI Galway for this important conference hosted by the School of Law that will attempt to consider critically the legal legacy of 1916 and related events. The conference has been organised by my colleagues Conor Hanley, Owen Daly and Gerard Quinn, with considerable assistance from one of our doctoral candidates, Maria Portuondo. And it affords us an opportunity, I think, to transcend the limitations of commemoration and to share open-minded but critical perspectives on the basic themes of the conference: law, revolution, and sovereignty. In a university setting, it should go without saying that academic disciplines coexist comfortably while conversing confidently across disciplinary boundaries in a jurisdiction of the mind where the offence of trespass is unknown. Sadly, even in an era of fetishized and utilitarian multidisciplinarity, we can remain marooned in our silos, engaging only from a respectable difference with other disciplines. It is therefore, I think, with a sense of genuine trepidation that a group made up largely of lawyers approaches a topic on which historians have, especially in recent weeks, staked their claim as the authoritative thought leaders and, in some cases, very public intellectuals. Mindful of the fact that we are all just one drink away from interdisciplinarity and that no drink is likely to be consumed until later this evening, I wish the lawyers who are speaking today well. Those of us who are speaking tomorrow will probably discover that whatever bacchanalian interdisciplinarity we experienced this evening was sadly fleeting. This conference is the School of Law contribution to the series of events organised by the university to mark the centenary of the 1916 Rising called A Nation Rising. That series has been coordinated with great expertise and flair by Dr. Mary Harris of our History Department, and it's a great personal pleasure to introduce her to you now to say a few opening words.
Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you to Conor and his team for inviting me to say a few words at the beginning of this. I must say, as a coordinator of the programme, I am overwhelmed at times with the amount of activity that's going on, but I also find it enormously exciting. I find I need to factor in more time to walk across campus because people are likely to stop me along the way and tell me the latest on their project. And it has been a great opportunity to get to see what other disciplines are doing, how they're approaching particular questions, how they're acting, and I think the interdisciplinarity that's arising from all of this will be very beneficial for us all in the end. Now, we're approaching this commemoration in a uniquely favourable climate for academic exploration. First of all, the ideological climate is much more open than it was in the 1960s. We have now access to the papers of some historians writing in the 1960s about their work, and we can see there what factors were constraining them in terms of the current climate in their era. The deference to relatives, for example, Margaret Pearse, Pearse's sister, was still alive until 1968, and of course Kathleen Clark, Tom Clark's wife, was still alive at this period, so there's a certain concern and deference regarding these. There are constraints imposed by people by public opinion, and we have interesting letters from Dennis Gwynn, a Cork-based historian, on what it was like writing for the Cork Examiner and how far he could go and how far he couldn't go without incurring the dissatisfaction of the local bishop. So there are various factors like that were quite constraining in the 1960s, and some of you will be well aware of a famous article by Father Francis Shaw, which was withheld from studies in the spring Easter Rising issue because it was seen as out of tune with the time. Now, if we move on to the 75th anniversary, we find the commemoration was very muted indeed because of the embarrassment regarding the armed struggle in the context of what was happening in Northern Ireland. But since the ceasefire, things have opened up a lot, debates have opened up, but we also have gained from other developments. For example, improvement in resourcing of repositories has been a huge step forward. The availability of material on the internet is extraordinary. It has opened up the possibilities of much wider engagement. If you take, for example, the Bureau of Military History's 1,770-something witness statements, we can all access these online now. They're on open access, and this opens up debate as well. Or the military service pension records, which we can all access. So there's a lot of new information out there that can be mined. We also are benefiting from advances and the emergence of new areas of studies, further development of new areas of study. Obviously, women's studies is very important here, but also wider notions of gender studies and studies, theories regarding masculinity can feed into this. Post-colonial studies, further developments in social history have all helped our perspectives. Now, turning to the particular issue here of the proclamation and what came after it, this is an intriguing question that has occupied quite a lot of my thought time, because the period running up to this was one of enormous optimism and excitement. A great cultural ferment. We have wonderful accounts from people like Mary Cullum, a literary critic, of what it was like to be in Dublin at the time, or Austin Clarke, the poet as well, was a young man at this point. And we have overlapping intellectual networks engaged in projects for social, cultural, political improvement. And there were quite a lot of internal tensions within these groups and tensions between them. But there was a certain amount of constructive ambiguity about the way they proceeded, and they all were heading in the general direction of the progress of Ireland, whatever that meant. And perhaps the most exciting instance of this was a magazine called the Irish Review, which in its opening pages declared the intention, or as its aim, the application of Irish intelligence to the reconstruction of Irish life, which is a very noble aim, and in a sense it involved Plunkett, MacDonagh, and a variety of people who later died in 1916. But then if we come to the proclamation itself, we see that between 1912 and 1916, a considerable shift had taken place, partly because of the challenge of Ulster Unionists, which left Home Rule in jeopardy, and also the whole context of the First World War. And we have interesting accounts, particularly from Pearse in 1912, about his own mental processes, which he was quite happy to share with the reading public in his newspaper, An Bord Bua. He's agonising about what should happen, and at a certain point he came to the conclusion that all good causes, he listed a range of good causes, the land question, the university question, the women's question, the language question, very close to his heart. They should all be shelved, and all-out efforts should be made to achieve independence. And we see a narrowing of perspective from 1912 to 16. We find the Irish Review that I mentioned folding because its leading figures at this point, Plunkett and MacDonagh, are focusing their attention elsewhere. But there was the intention on the part of Pearse and others of revisiting these things after independence. Or if we take, let's say, Connolly's view, he believed at a certain point that independence had to be achieved if he was to progress his other objectives. There was an assumption that issues were being parked and to be resumed after the great achievement had been won. But of course, for those of us who work in the period after independence, we see the extent to which that didn't happen. The cultural verve and the social agendas seemed to dissipate. The business, we could say in one sense that those who fought the good fight in 1916 were extremely idealistic and hadn't thought of the business of actually running a modern state. The emergence of a civil service, for example, was abhorrent to some of them. And the notion of bureaucracy seemed totally at odds with the kind of decentralised cultural organisations that had existed earlier. So the gap between the dream and the hope of this wonderfully egalitarian, somewhat decentralised society and what emerged subsequently, admittedly it got off to a very bad start, having incurred debts during the Civil War. And the whole question of legislation, I have thought before I was ever invited to this conference, is a key issue here, because we could have a lot of constructive ambiguity on the margins of various cultural activities, but obviously when it came to passing legislation, people had to be much more specific, and with the specification and clarification that's required by legal minds for legal processes, there is, of course, marginalisation and exclusion in a way that wasn't necessarily the case earlier on, where there was this kind of amorphous hope of something wonderful emerging in the stream of a new Ireland. So I'm looking forward to see how you legal scholars are going to deal with this. Thank you.
So we have a message as well from the Chancellor of the National University of Ireland, Dr. Maurice Manning, and I'll just read it out. He says, thank you for the high honour of opening this conference here at NUI Galway. I'm sorry that other commitments have drawn me away today and that I cannot be with you in person. The proceedings today cover law, revolution and sovereignty. It's really about people who had certain visions of the future, people who made sacrifices, people who were innocent victims, and yes, even the British Army. Every revolution has sacrifices and innocent victims, and we hope every revolution justifies itself by the endeavours of succeeding generations. It is said that many, if not most, polities are born in political violence. It is even said that these revolutionary moments are themselves law-giving moments, moments that justify the rupture from the past. The question, was it legal, is important to ask, but the question, how did we conceive and progressively reconceive our sovereignty in law, is extremely important. It defines us in relation to the world. It either cuts us off or opens us up. That arc of sovereignty reflected in law is what draws us here today. I know you have drawn together some of the best jurists in Ireland today. I know you have the openness of mind and heart to view the arc of our sovereignty from the eyes of others, especially our brothers and sisters in Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom. Remembering is part of reimagining. I wish you well today in both remembering and also reimagining. Upon leaving the chamber in which the US Declaration of Independence was announced, Benjamin Franklin was asked by a bystander, "What have you brought about?" His answer was, "A republic, if you can keep it." What we inherited from the fateful decade after 1916 needs to be constantly remade. It's up to you, the future generation, to frame our inheritance and to reimagine it for the next century. That's what citizenship is all about, and I am delighted to see it alive in our beloved National University, Maurice Manning. Okay, so our speaker this morning, our opening speaker, is Mr. Justice John MacMenamin. Mr. Justice MacMenamin is a judge of the Irish Supreme Court. He was educated at University College Dublin, where he studied history, and the King's Inns also in Dublin. He was called to the bar in 1975 and became a senior counsel in 1991. He was chairman of the Bar Council from 1997 to 1999, and he had a mixed practice with an emphasis on commercial law, insurance, and defamation law. Mr. Justice MacMenamin was appointed to the High Court in 2005, and he was appointed to the Supreme Court, where he serves with great distinction, in February of 2012. Please welcome Mr. Justice John MacMenamin.
Thanks very much.
You don't need the calculator, I take it.
Unless I go over that much over time. I'm delighted to be here today, and I love coming to UCG, as I insist on calling it. And Pache, Maurice Manning. My enjoyable contacts to this university go back as far as my student days debating, and as recently as participation in Gerard Quinn's wonderful conferences every year in disability law, which bring representatives from 55 different countries participating in a really imaginative way on a very important subject. I've never left UCG, as I insist on calling it again, without a pang of envy. Those of you who are lucky enough to teach here and to be students here should realize how lucky you truly are. This conference, I think, is a reminder, if we needed a reminder, that while this university lies at the western side of the island, it lies truly at the heart and centre of this island's thinking and imagination, not just on this issue, but so many others. We're here to consider a historical event, one hugely significant in our history, and we're invited to think about law, revolution and sovereignty, both in the context of the Rising and what followed. And I say what followed because at one level there's a risk of concluding with hindsight that there's a linear, inevitable, continuous progression between what occurred in 1916 to 1921, from 1922 to 1937, and 1937 to today. Nothing would be further from the truth. There was nothing inevitable about what happened during those periods. There are no inevitabilities in constitutional history any more than there are inevitabilities in any other form of history. But although history does not consist in inevitable progression, there can be evolution in thinking. And I believe strongly that our own thinking on this historic event has evolved and continues to evolve. There has both been a transition and a transformation in our capacity to analyse. This present process in which we, the people, and you, the scholars of history, are engaged, that of reflecting on the rising, is a further step in what is actually a continuous and progressive understanding of what it is to be and to live in a sovereign, independent, democratic republic in the words of the Constitution. All of these words, as we all know, are values. They are genuine values with meaning and effect, and not mere shibboleths. They are fundamental in all senses of the word. The law as expressed through the Constitution is defined and expressed through a self-ruling sovereign state where all power ultimately comes from the people and not from the barrel of a gun. And that process of continuous self-definition and self-realization has been long, arduous, and come at a huge cost in human life, tragedy, and bitterness. But part of that transition into a self-aware but not self-absorbed sovereignty is the fact that we have now come surely to a point where we can reassess the events of 1916 as being a truly historical event, rather than as a political catch-cry or a propaganda tool. I think that this realization alone is a measure of the extent to which our thinking has evolved and our awareness of living in a state governed by the rule of law has come to the fore. We can now look at our evolution as a state with the feeling of pride but objectivity. And understanding the past is necessary in order for us now to understand ourselves as a society as well as a state. Ireland and Irish history is not just about institutions or constitutions, but also people's lives and their work and their dignity. And while this conference correctly looks at what is called input legitimacy, that is to say, the legitimacy and actions of the state through its institutions and constitutions and structures, we must not forget, I believe, the concept of output legitimacy. That is what the state and its institutions did or did not do to enhance people's lives and dignity post-independence. We are not only dealing with theory or abstraction, but what people thought, felt, and lived. And legitimacy is not just a political, but also a social issue. In the context of today, the extraordinary transition in the nature of our society makes it even more difficult to understand the past as a different country. We can and should feel pride in what was achieved not only in 1916 by the nation builders, but also the sometimes unsung state makers, such as Thomas McLaughlin, who initiated the Ardnacrusha electric scheme, which in turn inspired many other rural electrification projects internationally, and was in fact one of the things which Franklin Roosevelt sought information on in 1929, 3 years before he became president in 1932. The framers who drafted the Constitution of 1922 and 1937, which we judges uphold, are also, I think, perhaps not given as much attention as they deserve. Notably, John Hearne and other great state servants, the state makers such as John Leyden down to T.K. Whitaker, whose own centenary, his 100th birthday, will be celebrated on the 8th of December this year. He's still with us and still hale and hearty. Coming forward, but still speaking of history, we can think especially of one particular great graduate of this university, Seamus Henchy, one of my great ancestors, as it were, on the Supreme Court, one of our great state makers, our state shapers. And the centenary of his birth is next year. I choose these other names not out of disrespect to the politicians and statesmen, but rather as a reminder that there are many forms of patriotism, and the attainment of sovereignty does not consist in chest beating or triumphalism. There were many other state makers and state shapers during the 1920s, 30s and 40s, and I'm sure we will hear of them today, the diplomats, the politicians, the lawyers, who engaged in a process which not only involved a transition to a republic in 1937, but also were the harbingers and bringers about of the end of an empire that had been 350 years in the making. We may also hear of the role that the Irish judiciary played in the 1920s and 1930s in the evolution of a distinctly independent Irish theory of constitutional legitimacy derived from popular sovereignty. As I said earlier, the period of transformation and transition in which we are engaged must also consist in a recognition that the celebration of 1916, such as what we're doing today, is itself a historical event, just as we look back on what happened in 1966. And I think the conference is valuable because, along with other conferences, it marks the importance of national constitutional history. The contributors to this conference and the participants, I think, are particularly to be complimented because the subject matter of this conference is of high national importance, but perhaps far removed from the allure of peer-reviewed articles in international law journals. So consequently, I think you're particularly to be congratulated. It concerns true scholarship, this conference. It's about thought and imagination. And if the events of the last weeks have proved anything in this country, it's the absolute imperative of ensuring that states and localities support and maintain scholarly links with their own historical narratives through independent, objective scholarship in law and history. And as part of that analysis by future historians, I hope there will be a recognition that we as a state must continue to understand and support the proposition that legal history and history teaching and independent scholarship are all vitally important to the state. Understanding history is vital to understanding ourselves, and there is no other surrogate for that. Its significance is shown, I think, in the fact that in the past weeks we have all, in a sense, become historians. Internationally, and even within our own European Union, there is evidence that xenophobes and enemies of democracy seek to exploit events or narratives which they selectively portray as history, thereby legitimizing their extremism and hatred of the other. And facts can give way to emotion, sense gives way to sensation, and there is a risk that the centre will fragment. That's how important history is. While, of course, historians deprecate the very notion of history having a use beyond its own obvious intrinsic use, one cannot ignore the necessity to ensure that the integrity and objectivity of historical narrative is not destroyed by selectivity in the use of evidence. Spin is not just part of present-day media culture. The characters in history belong in history to be assessed in the context of their times by the standards of their times. We've very successfully surmounted the challenge of understanding 1916, but there are more profound historical challenges yet to come in the next 6 years, up to the anniversaries of 1917, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. And I think that we sometimes lose sight of the evolution from revolution to evolution in attaining sovereignty. And surely now it's time we gave greater recognition to those who played such a critical role in drafting our constitutional development, both in 1922 and 1937. James Douglas, Hugh Kennedy, James McNeill, Darrell Figgis, C.J. France, Alfred O'Reilly, Kevin O'Shiel. I bet very few people, apart from the participants in this conference, know those names. The utterly enigmatic C.J. France, who was told to leave Ireland. Darrell Figgis, who is like a figure from a Dostoevsky novel, who took his own life in London in 1925. And both of those require so much more scholarly research. And then later, Philip O'Donoghue, John Hearn, particularly John Hearn, Stephen Roach, Michael McDunphy, Arthur Matheson, who all engaged in the hard process of evolution, state shaping, and stemming from revolution. So obviously did Collins, Cosgrave, McGilligan, De Valera, Lamass, Aitken, Dullanty, Hearn. But so much was done by the drafters, the negotiators, the state makers and shapers, the negotiators, the diplomats, and those charged with implementing policy. And so many of those names, all of those names, remind us what a very patriarchal society we are talking about when we talk about the past. So much work has been done by Gerard Hogan, Dermot Keogh, Andrew McCarthy. And can I say, just concluding, as a judge, some criticise the 1937 Constitution for its having been excessively influenced by external factors in the drafting process, particularly the Roman Catholic Church. But when one looks at the historic context, I think the mark of the achievement is not how great that influence was, but in fact, in the climate of times, that the influence of those external factors remained somewhat limited to the extent they did. Speaking as a judge, what is particularly noteworthy is the extent to which fundamental rights were placed at the centre of the document as a truly enduring legacy at a time when the climate of opinion in Europe was so profoundly opposed to those values from the right and left. What the conference concerns, therefore, is a transition from revolution to statehood and sovereignty, where the law played a vital part, a pivotal part, as the means of expression. We remind ourselves that sovereignty was not an end in itself, and that behind our discussion of the law and history, there are the sovereign people. I look forward to both reading and hearing the papers of the conference, and I hope I'm not being presumptuous in suggesting that in some form the papers will be gathered together and published or made available, as they themselves are a written monument of how far we've come, and perhaps also how far we have still to go into integrating the past into our thinking about the present. If you'd like to look at some pictures for social context, I'll give you some pictures. Just have a look there of what the life was in Dublin during the 1930s and in rural Ireland. That's T.J. McLaughlin, that's Ardna Crusher. That's a very fine painting by Sean Keating in the Russian Socialist Realist School, which he painted in 1929. You see the workers from Galway there at work building the dam, and Keating's family at the top right-hand side, with him pointing the way to the future. Now, they're the drafters of the 1922 Constitution. Now, I ask you questions, name them all. If you just look there, that's C.J. France, a lawyer from Seattle in Washington State, who might have been associated with the International Workers of the World. And why he was withdrawn so quickly, I do not know yet. The significant factor is that Senator James Douglas, one of the other characters in the same photograph, demanded his withdrawal and said there'd be trouble if there wasn't. And there beside him was Gerald Figgis, the man who died tragically in London in 1925. There's John Hearn. There's T.K. Whitaker. There's Arthur Matheson. There's Seamus Henchy. There's Dev in the League of Nations in 1938. The high point maybe of the realization of sovereignty. The army, the police, court system, T.K. Whitaker. But I leave you just with that when we're talking about sovereignty. This is what T.K. Whitaker wrote in 1957. If we do not expand our production, and this is in the context of having been involved in an economic protection regime for 30 years, and particularly in the context of the lost years of 1945 to 1955, if we do not expand our production on a competitive basis, it would be better to make an immediate move towards incorporation in the United Kingdom, rather than that our economic decadence becomes even more apparent. And I think that's a fairly startling statement. That's the last thing I'll show you. That if you look at that graph, that's the income per head between 1940, I think, and 1960, during which time there was a protectionist regime. And then when Whitaker and the first programme took place, look what happened afterwards. This is why I think social context is interesting. And that is also something which is of significance in the social context of what we're talking about today. The population of Ireland between 1920 and 1960 declined by 1 million people, down to 2.8 million. Emigration. So it's in that context that I raise the issue of when we talk about sovereignty, whether sovereignty at some stage did become an end in itself rather than a means to bringing about output legitimacy, that is achieving dignity, work, life, and the possibility of self-realization. Thank you very much.